Most of my life, I've been the kind of person who prefers the familiar. Routine is comforting, predictable. I like knowing what's ahead, and I like keeping things orderly. On weekdays, I start my mornings with a cup of coffee, sitting at the kitchen table while watching the sunrise through the window. I enjoy the stillness of those moments before the day truly begins. Weekends are my time to break the pattern, to get out of my comfort zone just a little. Like taking long drives into the countryside, exploring backroads and small towns that most people miss. That's what I was doing the day I found Ravenwood. I wasn't planning to visit Ravenwood. Something about the name gave me a weird feeling, like it was hiding a secret. The town wasn't even on the map. I was driving through Vermont's backroads to visit an old friend when I missed a turn and ended up on a narrow, winding road deep in the forest. My phone had lost signal, and the trees grew thicker, blocking out the light. Suddenly, the town appeared out of nowhere. A sign stood at the edge of the road, its paint chipped and faded. Welcome to Ravenwood. Population 194. The air was cold, and the temperature had dropped quickly. I decided to stop to ask for directions, maybe get some gas if there was a station. Ravenwood was too quiet. The streets were empty, and the buildings looked old, neglected for years. Something just didn't feel right, almost like the place was pushing me away. I saw a small general store at the end of the street, its lights dim but still on. I parked in front, gravel crunching under my tires in the silence. The bell above the door chimed as I stepped inside. The store was cluttered with dusty shelves full of old canned goods and faded labels. Behind the counter stood an elderly woman, her back hunched, her hair pulled into a tight bun. She looked up, her eyes cloudy but sharp, like she could see right through me. I greeted her and asked for directions back to the main highway. The woman stared at me, her eyes narrowing. "You shouldn't be here," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. I tried to explain that I was just passing through and needed directions, but she cut me off, her voice trembling as she said, "No one passes through Ravenwood. Once you're here, you stay." I chuckled nervously, but she didn't smile. I paid for a bottle of water, thanked her, and quickly left the store. As I stepped outside, the air turned colder, and a thick fog began to roll in, swallowing the edges of the town. I hurried back to my car, but the engine wouldn't start. I tried again. Nothing. The street was empty, and the fog thickened, creeping closer and swallowing everything. I looked around and saw them. Figures at the far end of the street, barely visible through the mist. They stood still, their shapes blending with the fog. I tried the ignition again. The engine sputtered, but wouldn't turn over. The figures were moving now, slowly, coming toward me. They weren't walking. They were gliding, their feet never touching the ground. I grabbed my bag, jumped out, and rushed back to the store. The bell chimed as I burst inside, slamming the door shut behind me. The old woman was still there, her eyes wide open. She whispered, "You shouldn't have come back." I demanded to know what those things were. She hesitated before answering, her voice low. "The lost. The ones who never left. They come with the fog, looking for someone to take their place." I asked her how to get out of Ravenwood, but she shook her head slowly, almost sadly. "You can't. Not until the fog lifts. You need to hide. If they see you, they'll take you." She led me to a small back room, cluttered with boxes and newspapers. She handed me a flashlight, her hands shaking. "Whatever happens, don't let the light go out," she said, her voice barely audible. I could hear them now, a low hum that grew louder, persistent. The fog pressed against the windows, and through the dim glass, I could see the figures, their hollow eyes staring, their mouths moving in a silent chant. The old woman motioned for me to stay quiet, her finger pressed to her lips. We waited, the whispers outside growing louder. The light from the flashlight flickered, and I tightened my grip. Hours seemed to pass, the whispers rising and falling like waves. The figures moved around the store, shifting in the fog as they searched. I stayed still, barely breathing, waiting for them to leave. Suddenly, There was a loud banging against the front door. I almost dropped the flashlight. The old woman's eyes widened, and she whispered, "They're getting impatient." She gestured for me to follow her to a trapdoor hidden under an old rug. She knelt down and pulled it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. "Go," she urged. "They won't follow you underground. They fear the dark below." The banging grew louder, and the whispers turned into overlapping voices. I climbed down the stairs, the old woman closing the trapdoor above me. The darkness swallowed me, and I fumbled with the flashlight, its beam barely cutting through the darkness. The cellar air was damp and cold. I could hear the faint sound of dripping water somewhere far away. The walls were lined with shelves filled with jars, their contents long since rotten. I moved slowly, the floor creaking under my weight. The flashlight flickered again, and I shook it until the light steadied. I found a corner and crouched down, trying to stay hidden. The whispers above seemed to seep through the floorboards, reminding me they were still searching. I closed my eyes, trying to stay quiet, my heart pounding in my chest. Time dragged on, and I knew I needed a plan. I couldn't stay here forever. I scanned the cellar, the flashlight revealing a small, rusted door at the far end. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but it might be my only way out. Slowly, I crept toward it, my footsteps barely making a sound. I pushed the door open, revealing a narrow tunnel extending into darkness. The air was even colder here, and the walls were damp, but it was a way out. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, the flashlight casting long shadows on the rough stone walls. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning, the air growing colder with each step. The whispers above faded, leaving an unsettling silence around me. I kept moving, my fingers numb on the flashlight. Finally, I saw it, a faint light at the end of the tunnel. I picked up the pace, my hope rising. As I got closer, I realized it was a grate, the moonlight filtering through from above. I climbed up, pushing the grate aside, and pulled myself out into the open air. I found myself in the middle of the forest, surrounded by towering trees. The fog had lifted, and the air was crisp and clear. I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs, and finally felt a glimmer of hope. I didn't waste any time. I ran, branches scratching at my arms, the ground uneven beneath my feet. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get as far away from Ravenwood as possible. The whispers were gone, but their memory lingered. Eventually, I stumbled onto a road. The asphalt cracked and overgrown. I followed it, my legs aching until I saw headlights in the distance. I waved my arms and the car slowed to a stop. The driver rolled down the window, concern etched on his face. He asked if I was okay. I nodded, though I knew I looked far from okay, and said I just needed to leave. He opened the passenger door, and I climbed in, sinking into the seat. As we drove away, I looked back, but there was nothing. No fog, no figures, just the dark outline of the forest. The man glanced at me, curious, but I shook my head. "You wouldn't believe me," I said. He didn't ask anything else, and I was grateful. I closed my eyes, exhausted. I never found Ravenwood on any map after that. It was like the town had never existed. But sometimes, late at night, when the fog rolls in, I still hear the whispers, faint and distant, calling me back. And I know that if I find myself on that road again, I might not resist. Lately, I found myself restless. I'd spend hours at home, trying to distract myself with hobbies that no longer held my interest. Even the long drives I used to enjoy had lost their charm. I realized I needed something different, a real escape. Not just from the monotony of my routines, but from the feeling that I was stuck in place. I wanted to feel that sense of adventure again, that thrill of the unknown. So, one afternoon, I decided to just drive. No destination in mind, just hoping the open road would give me something I couldn't find at home. The winding roads of upstate New York seemed perfect at first. The trees blurred by, and I began to feel a sense of calm I hadn't felt in a long time. But then my GPS died, and suddenly that calm began to slip away. I told myself it was part of the adventure. Getting a little lost never hurt anyone. But as the unfamiliar roads twisted deeper into the woods, I couldn't help but feel like I was heading somewhere I shouldn't be. The trees grew thicker, their shadows closing in, and the roads got narrower. I started feeling more isolated than free. That's when I saw the rusted sign, "Welcome to Silverdale." The town was tiny, hidden behind thick woods and forgotten roads. It was late afternoon when I drove in, and the sun barely peeked through the clouds, casting a cold, gray light over everything. Silverdale looked like it hadn't changed in decades. Old houses with sagging porches and peeling paint lined the single road through the town. It felt frozen in time, like it had more secrets than people. I decided to stop, mainly because I needed gas and directions. I pulled up to a tiny, run-down gas station that looked like it came straight out of a 1950s postcard. The pump creaked as I filled my tank, and the air smelled like rain mixed with something metallic, like rust or blood. The bell above the door chimed as I walked in. An elderly man sat behind the counter, his eyes cloudy and unfocused. He looked up at me, his gaze sharpening just a little. He asked if I was lost, his voice gravelly, as though he hadn't spoken in a while. I explained that my GPS had died and I needed directions to the nearest highway. He gave me a long look before shaking his head and murmuring, "This place isn't kind to visitors." I let out a short laugh, but he didn't react. His eyes flicked toward the window, and I followed his gaze. The sky had darkened, and fog was rolling in fast, coiling around the base of the trees and creeping across the street. He warned me to leave before the fog got thick, saying it wasn't safe after dark. I nodded, feeling a chill settle in my chest. I left the gas station quickly, his warning echoing in my mind. As I climbed back into my car, I noticed the fog was getting worse, covering the town in a thick white haze. I drove slowly, trying to find my way out, but the road twisted and turned unpredictably. The fog covered my windshield, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. No matter which direction I chose, it felt like I was driving in circles. Eventually, I saw a building through the mist, a small motel with a flickering neon sign that said, "Vacancy." The fog was so thick now that I had no choice but to stop for the night. The inside of the motel office smelled damp, and a young woman with tired eyes and a forced smile sat behind the desk. She handed me a key, her eyes lingering on the fog outside. I asked if everything was okay, noticing the tension in her face. She glanced at the window, then back at me, and said I should stay inside that night and keep the door locked. Her fear was evident. I thanked her, took the key, and made my way to my room. The room was small and musty, with faded wallpaper and an old TV that probably hadn't worked in years. I locked the door and pulled the curtains closed, but I still felt uneasy, like I wasn't alone. The fog outside got thicker, pressing against the windows, and soon the whispers started. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, like voices speaking just out of earshot. I listened closely and heard my name. It was faint, almost a sigh, but unmistakable. I moved away from the window, trying to understand what I'd heard. Maybe it was a trick of the wind, or my tired mind playing games. Then there was a knock at the door, 3 soft, deliberate knocks that echoed through the room. I froze, staring at the door. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if they were all around me. I called out, barely above a whisper, asking who was there. No answer. Just another knock, this one louder, more demanding. My eyes darted to the window. Through a gap in the curtains, I could see a shadow moving in the fog, tall and thin, almost human but not quite right. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like it was being pulled by invisible strings. I stumbled backward until I hit the wall. The whispers grew louder, calling my name, telling me to open the door. I grabbed the chair from the corner of the room and wedged it under the doorknob, my hands shaking. The knocking stopped, but the whispers continued, fading, but still there. I stayed up all night, sitting on the floor, staring at the door until dawn. The whispers faded with the morning, leaving only an eerie silence behind. I carefully approached the window and peeked outside. The fog was still there, but it was thinner now, and the shadow was gone. I wasted no time. I grabbed my things and left the motel. The young woman at the desk was nowhere to be found. The town was just as empty as the day before, the fog slowly receding as I drove away. The road twisted and turned, but eventually, I found my way back to the highway, finally feeling some relief once Silverdale was far behind me. Even now, I feel like the town is still out there waiting. The whispers haven't stopped. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear them calling my name, urging me to return to Silverdale. And sometimes, when the mist is thick, I swear I see that shadow at the edge of the woods, watching. Every morning, I'd get up early, make myself a cup of coffee, and sit on the porch, watching the mist roll through the redwoods. There was something really comforting about that routine. The quiet of the forest, the way the sunlight barely made it through the tall trees. It was the peace I had been searching for. A chance to breathe and start over. Redwood Hollow seemed perfect for that, or at least I hoped it would be. After losing my job and my relationship falling apart, I needed a place where I could just be without any pressure. My uncle's old cabin with its creaky floors and peeling paint felt like the perfect escape. Life here was simple. I spent my days cleaning up the cabin, walking in the woods, and going into town for supplies. It felt like nothing bad could happen here. But there was something about Redwood Hollow that just didn't sit right. People kept to themselves, and they avoided looking at me after sunset. It was like they knew something I didn't, something they weren't willing to tell me. In my second week in Redwood Hollow, I first heard about the shadows. I was at the diner, having a cup of coffee and reading the newspaper, when I overheard two older men talking quietly at the counter. One of them mentioned something about an incident near the old mill, and they looked around to make sure no one else was listening. The other whispered that it was the shadows again, that the hollow was restless. They noticed me glancing over and quickly changed the subject, their voices dropping and their eyes darting around. I pretended to go back to my newspaper, but I couldn't shake what I'd heard. Later that day, I asked Mrs. Harper, my neighbor, about the shadows. She narrowed her eyes, just like the men in the diner. She didn't want to talk about it, and just warned me to stay inside after dark and keep the lights dim. The shadows, she said, didn't like to be watched. I tried to laugh it off, thinking it was just some small-town superstition to keep newcomers in line, but the serious look in her eyes stuck with me. About a week later, I found out what she meant. I'd spent the whole day cleaning out the old shed behind the cabin and lost track of time. By the time I got inside, the sun had already set, and the forest was dark. I locked the door, turned off the lights, and sat in the living room with a soda, tired but proud of what I'd done. It wasn't long before I heard it, a soft rustling, like leaves moving across the ground. I paused, listening. The noise got louder, moving around the side of the cabin. I got up and peeked through the curtains into the dark yard. At first I saw nothing. Then near the edge of the trees I noticed movement. Shadows, shifting and swirling in a way that didn't match the wind. They were darker than the night, blending in and out of the trees, moving smoothly. I stayed still, holding my breath. The shadows crept closer, rippling like smoke. No faces, no features, just darkness. It felt like they knew I was there, watching. I dropped the curtain and stepped back as the rustling grew louder, moving around the cabin. I turned off every light in the cabin, my hands trembling. Mrs. Harper's words echoed in my mind. Keep the lights dim. Stay quiet. Don't watch. I crouched in the dark, back against the wall, eyes closed, waiting. The rustling intensified, a mix of whispers and scratching, making it hard to think. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. The silence was intense, I stayed still. Minutes passed, then an hour, and I finally gathered the courage to stand. I slowly moved to the window and peeked out. The yard was empty. The shadows were gone, lost in the forest's darkness. I let out a slow breath, feeling a bit calmer. The next morning, I went into town, determined to get some answers. The sun was shining, and the town seemed peaceful compared to the night before. When I found Mrs. Harper in her garden, she listened quietly as I told her what happened. Mrs. Harper explained that the shadows were restless. They didn't want to hurt anyone, but they didn't like to be seen. She said they had been around longer than anyone could remember, drawn to things they had lost, people, memories, life. I wanted to ask more, to understand what these shadows really were, but the look in her eyes made me stop. Some things in Redwood Hollow were better left alone. The shadows were one of them. That night, I made sure to be inside well before sunset. I kept the lights off, curtains closed, and sat in the dark, listening as the rustling started again. The shadows moved through the yard, brushing against the cabin walls. I stayed still, eyes closed, waiting for them to pass. And they did. The noise faded, replaced by the sounds of the night. Crickets chirping, wind rustling the leaves. I opened my eyes, feeling calmer. I knew then that Redwood Hollow wasn't just a place to escape my past. It was a place that demanded respect, where the past lingered, shadows roamed, and the line between the living and the lost was thin. From that day on, I followed the rules of Redwood Hollow. I stayed inside after dark, kept the lights dim, and never watched the shadows. It was the price for peace, a quiet acceptance of what lay beyond the light.